Good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony Guida. I'm the Director of Sustainability at AOS Architects in Santa Fe and President of Friends of Architecture of Santa Fe. I want to welcome all of you to ReVisioning Preservation. This is another installment in the ReVisioning History series, which features leading community voices and the public in discussion about the future of our shared built environment by way of critically re-examining the way Santa Fe has made plans for the future. ReVisioning Preservation is the second of our in-depth sessions in 2020, and it follows ReVisioning Planning. The recording of that session, which was hosted 2 months ago, is available through our website, architecturesantafe.org. Upcoming sessions include ReVisioning Housing, ReVisioning Sustainability, and we hope to have several more in 2021. A brief note about Friends of Architecture Santa Fe. We are an independent nonprofit. We create informed conversations about design and the built environment towards a more vibrant, equitable, and sustainable Santa Fe. Panel discussions in the ReVisioning History series are but one of our programs. Our other public offerings include design charrettes, tours, and pechacucha, the art of concise and fast-paced storytelling. You can learn more about all of our programs, including the ReVisioning History series, at architecturesantafe.org. Just before we get started, and so I can get out of the way, a brief outline of tonight's session. We're going to have 120 minutes for this, or 2 hours. The first half of the session will be a series of 10-minute presentations by our panelist speakers. The second half will be an interactive, moderated panel discussion with your Q&A. Note that AIA members will earn 2 HSW learning units tonight. This is intended to be a participatory event, so please use the Q&A button to submit your questions as we go along. We'll be feeding your questions to our moderator behind the scenes, and we'll try our best to get through to all of them. You may submit anonymously, but we will otherwise include your name when your question is put to the panel. If your question is aimed at a particular speaker, please say so in your note. As tonight's discussion is about all of us developing a better understanding of our place in the history of this land, I want to welcome one of tonight's speakers, Preservation Officer and former Governor for the Pueblo of Tesuque, Mark Mitchell, to start us off by sharing a people and land acknowledgement. Mark?
Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm former governor from the Pueblo of Tesuque, and currently I work as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the tribe. First and foremost, welcome to the homelands, ancestral homelands of Tesuque Pueblo, otherwise known as Ocapogi people. And with that, I hope we have a good turnout and questioning and answering session. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. So I have one more thing to do before I get out of the way, and that's introduce tonight's host and Friends of Architecture board member, Lisa Gavioli-Roach. As the Historic Preservation Manager for the City of Santa Fe, Lisa recognizes that the importance of saving old buildings lies not just in preserving the physical fabric of place, but in creating the opportunity for living people to tell their stories, to connect with the past, and to derive meanings that can shape their community's future. Lisa received her master's degree in community and regional planning and graduate certificate in historic preservation from the University of New Mexico and studied ancestral Puebloan archaeology at the University of Arizona, where she received a Master of Arts in anthropology. Lisa is committed to reframing historic preservation as a tool to promote sustainable development, creative placemaking, community storytelling, and social equity. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Anthony. Welcome everyone to Revisioning Preservation. Thank you, Anthony, for the introduction, and Mark for the beautiful acknowledgement, and to everyone on the Friends of Architecture Santa Fe board for all your hard work and dedication in producing and promoting the Revisioning History series. It is my extreme pleasure to be with you this evening and for our third session in the series. And I'm joined tonight by an incredible panel of thinkers here to talk about historic preservation in Santa Fe and to begin a dialogue about where we've been, where we are today, and where we want to go from here. And I should say as we begin that the ideas I'll share tonight are not the official position of the city of Santa Fe, but are instead my own personal reflections on the issues. So, old buildings hold great power to evoke emotion and imagination, to give us a sense of continuity with the past, to make us feel connected with a story from another time. This power, this allure of historic places has been a driving force for me, both personally and professionally. In my work as an archaeologist, the past, though distant, always felt incredibly tangible for me. I felt a deep sense of stewardship, immersing myself in the places I studied, and I felt connected to those places, not by memory of the past, but by direct experience of interacting with old places and objects, collecting evidence that would allow me and others to imagine the everyday lives of the people who came before. But the places I studied as an archaeologist were ruins, long abandoned homes that were mostly quiet now, relics from the distant past, being unearthed by archaeologists, bagged and labeled, reduced to drawings, forms, and imaginings. I ultimately left the practice of archaeology for many of the same reasons that drew me into it in the first place. I left with the feeling that the stories that descendant communities had to tell about those places and objects I studied were at least as important, if not very much more so, than my own personal connection to or scientific understanding of someone else's heritage. And I felt sure that the laws were flawed. In my work as a community-based preservation planner, I've explored the complexity of heritage resource management, historic preservation laws, and the impacts on local communities of regulatory systems that seem to value rigid notions of physical integrity and design harmony over the people who built them, or the ability of their children and grandchildren to continue to reside there, or the telling of a multitude of stories of place and history. Santa Fe's historic districts are as exquisite in their aspect as they are alluring in the sentiments they conjure. They are unparalleled treasures of architectural revivalism and restoration. However, there are distinct challenges that have been presented by preservation in Santa Fe as elsewhere. The changes in neighborhood makeup that have taken place over 60 plus years of regulation, the singular reliance on tourism for economic development, the proliferation of second home ownership and vacation rentals, the dramatic rise in property values. Our historic districts are contested places where differing values are confronted, defined almost as much by what has been lost as by what has been saved. Our historic districts struggle to hang on as living neighborhoods, yearning for the sound of children playing in the arroyos and neighbors gossiping over fence posts, for the many layered textures of home and the eccentricities of a diverse community. In some respects, they've become curated collections, artifacts of a time gone by and products of the nostalgia and romanticism of centuries past. But what do they mean for us today? And what role will they play in shaping Santa Fe's future? The answers to these questions are inherently multiple. And our task this evening is to anchor our dialogue about where we go from here by taking a look back at some of the studies, regulatory frameworks, and plans that have explored the diverse meanings our built heritage has held for the people here over the last century of preservation. So I want to introduce the topic of revisioning preservation by speaking for a moment about the origins of historic preservation in Santa Fe. And I want to start by taking a look at some of the forces that converged over a century ago to take a remote frontier town with a dwindling population and refashion it as one of the world's most distinctive cities. An examination of historic preservation's roots in Santa Fe begins amidst the romanticism that framed much of the dialogue around social and urban reform in the US in the early 20th century. a movement that characterized the arts and intellectualism in the Western world at the time, Romanticism placed emphasis on emotion and glorification of the past and nature. It was in part a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the scientific rationalization of nature associated with modernity at the time. It relied upon apprehension about the present and sought to escape the pitfalls of the modern, rapidly industrializing world through idealization of a noble past and purity of nature. Nostalgia was central to the Romantic movement. There was sentimentality for the past, a yearning for a bygone era that was simpler, more noble, and an underlying belief that the past was better or more authentic than the present. Amidst this backdrop of Romanticism and nostalgia was born the City Beautiful movement, a reform philosophy in architecture and planning at the turn of the 20th century that sought beautification and stylistic elevation, and by extension, moral elevation, in cities as a reaction to the ills of industrialization. Santa Fe's early leaders took concepts from the City Beautiful movement and transformed them into the City Different movement, still emphasizing social harmony through harmony of built form, but capitalizing on the unique architectural traditions in Santa Fe and the growing fascination with Pueblo Indian tourism. At its heart, the formalization of Santa Fe style and the birth of the City Different movement was about elevating what city leaders at the time saw as truly unique about this place and as highly marketable to a wealthy elite class whom they sought to attract to Santa Fe as both tourists and residents, and to transform Santa Fe into a city worthy of its state capital status. In this manner, Santa Fe became an early leader in the American historic preservation movement and sought to regulate architectural style as early as the first formally adopted city plan in 1912. Romanticization of Santa Fe's past and its indigenous Spanish and vernacular architectural traditions was foundational to the formation of Santa Fe style over the first half of the 20th century, during which time architects, archaeologists, and city planners sought to remove much of the evidence of stylistic diversity in favor of a revivalist and somewhat speculative sense of stylistic harmony, creating a new regionalism by selectively appropriating and increasingly requiring this newly created Santa Fe style to be utilized in and around the plaza. For more than 6 decades now, the city has regulated historic preservation and design in its historic districts. And during this time, we have largely succeeded in creating not only harmony, but continuity of a 20th century regional architectural tradition. In their stylistic unity, our historic districts convey the story of a community that values its built heritage and is willing to adhere to a highly prescriptive set of regulations in order to sustain that tradition and the telling of that particular story. But not everyone in our community feels that way. There have been other outcomes as well, some of which we may not like to admit, much less look at, outcomes that have served to disconnect many from the places that we hold sacred as a community, that represent our past, but also reflect who we are and what we value right here in the present. We are a community that faces significant challenges, from severe housing shortages, even as the luxury real estate market booms, to an increasing socioeconomic and geographical divide, and an economy struggling to diversify itself. We have been successful in preserving continuity of tradition and harmony of built form, and for many of us, this continues to be a noble endeavor worthy of the great many hoops that my team and I force property owners to jump through. However, what meanings does this practice hold for the large portions of our community that are disconnected from our historic districts and are no longer even engaged in conversations about historic preservation, except to condemn it? In my role as the Historic Preservation Division Manager for the City of Santa Fe, I'm engaged in the enormous task of administering Santa Fe's Historic Preservation Ordinance. And this summer, with a grant from the state, we've initiated the first phase of a long-range planning effort that may serve to chart preservation's future here. As we begin to ask ourselves how to re-envision a more equitable and inclusive historic preservation in Santa Fe, dozens of other communities across the country are doing the same. Nationally, historic preservation is in the midst of an existential crisis, coming to realize the systemic bias that has influenced outcomes like gentrification, displacement, over-reliance on outdated concepts of physical integrity and criteria for significance, and underrepresentation of the diversity of histories that every community holds. Santa Fe has an opportunity now to step into a leadership role once again, helping to show the rest of the country how it is that multiple stories and experiences about the past can be true at the same time, how we can provide better incentives for retaining our legacy residents and businesses, and how we can keep our historic neighborhoods alive with programs and public-private partnerships and regulations that acknowledge that heritage is a practice that must be lived to be preserved. This is what tonight's conversation is about. I firmly believe that Santa Fe's greatest assets are our people and our diverse stories. Old buildings are powerful, but without people to tell the stories that inform meaning, we are left with imagination and nostalgia. As David Lowenthal has said, that heritage is viable only in a living community is a tenet widely accepted but seldom acted upon. To sustain a legacy of stones, those who dwell among them also need stewardship. Our panelists tonight will each review a research or planning document that helps establish important themes and an understanding of how preservation has operated in Santa Fe and how we might reimagine its future here. Following a brief presentation by each panelist, we will introduce our guest moderator, Rachel Preston Prinz, who will offer some reflections on the presentations and guide an interactive discussion of the issues. As Anthony mentioned, the Q&A window is open, so please enter your questions there as they arise, and our team will do our best to bring them forward into the discussion section of the program, which truly is the most important and potentially actionable part of our time together this evening. First up, Shawn Evans will provide an overview of the 1957 Historical District Ordinance, comparing that original regulatory framework to the ordinance we have today. Beverley Spears will review a 1977 study entitled Design and Preservation in Santa Fe, a pluralistic approach, reflecting on the diversity of architectural styles, geographical settings, settlement patterns, and urban spaces within our historic districts. Mark Mitchell reminds us of the deeper history of pre-contact indigenous occupation of this place and of the rich cultural heritage that lies beneath our feet in his review of the 2005 Santa Fe Plaza Cultural Landscape Report. And finally, Estevan Rael-Gálvez will provide an overview of Culture Connect Santa Fe, the cultural cartography, the city's recent cultural planning process in which a diverse set of community voices spoke to the many ways culture and creativity connect us to one another in Santa Fe. And so with that, I'll invite Shawn Evans to share his screen. Thank you, Shawn.
Thank you, Lisa. Can everyone hear me?
Yes. So Shawn is the principal in charge of the Santa Fe office of AOS Architects, a 27-person architecture planning and preservation firm. He's led planning and preservation projects for the pueblos of Cochiti, Okeowinge, Santo Domingo, and Zuni, as well as Eastern State Penitentiary, Los Poblanos Historic Inn, and the Palace of the Governors. He's currently overseeing the Seiler Yard housing project in Santa Fe, among other projects. A graduate of Texas A&M University and the University of Pennsylvania, he has taught architectural design and preservation philosophy at Temple, Penn, and UNM. He's a past fellow of the James Marston Fitch Foundation and has spoken at many regional and national preservation, placemaking, and museum conferences. His work was featured in the 2018 Venice Biennial, an exhibit entitled A Future-Oriented Preservation. So take it away, Shawn.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm honored to be included in this important discussion. This is indeed a momentous time. During these last awful 6 months, we've witnessed a deep societal examination of monuments and memory in the wake of senseless tragedy, along with a nostalgia for simpler times of gathering in our great civic spaces. There's been a long overdue awakening that monuments have ulterior motives and that the simpler times never existed. A perfect time to re-envision preservation, to reframe it according to the contemporary and conflicting value systems of our communities, and to at long last remake preservation so that it serves people. Preservation has always been different in the city different. As practiced throughout the Western world, preservation originated in an understanding of monuments that signified a state-sanctioned display of wealth and power. As we'll discuss tonight, preservation in Santa Fe originated in a desire to protect a sense of place. And although there was certainly discussion of limiting change to buildings, it is clear that the preservation 100 years ago was understood to be more about streets and plazas, the spaces between, rather than obsessing over old buildings. For over a century, preservation here has focused on the concerns of tourists rather than its own citizens. In this time of social awakening, we must address the reality that our civic identity originates in a racial gaze that trivializes the deep culture of this place. It's time to recognize that the origin of the Santa Fe style and its preservation are grounded in appropriation and have resulted in extreme gentrification. This power structure is systematically racist. No longer intentional, but real nonetheless, and needing a new approach. We often talk of the 400 years of history here, but as was acknowledged a few moments ago and will be expanded upon later, Ogopoge has a much longer history. During those 500 years before the Spanish and the 270 years that followed prior to the railroad, building was vernacular, constructed and frequently modified to meet slowly changing needs rather than the dictates of artificial style. During the next 32 years, tradition was discarded and our urban identity was Americanized until statehood was obtained in 1912, at which time nostalgia and preservation were embraced, which continue to construct the myth of Santa Fe. If we are to re-envision preservation, we must understand how we got here. Here, a spectacular image of Santa Fe before it was a style. Whether governed by Spain, the Pueblos, Spain, Mexico, or the United States, the land and its buildings were really one and the same. Until the railroad brought new technology and building materials, enabling a remaking of Santa Fe to overcome racist attitudes towards the West in order to add our star to the flag. Yet a realization that we had sold our soul was growing, and our oldest monument, the Palace of the Governors, was remade in a form that it had never held. Through the new Old Santa Fe exhibit at the Palace, the Santa Fe style became doctrine in 1912. While the style was developed through analysis and documentation of our neighboring Pueblo villages, here seen in the remarkable collection of images gathered by Carlos Vieira, with Cochiti on the left and Isleta on the right, we cannot overlook that this style is also the product of the racist presentation of indigenous peoples as living spectacles at the world's fairs, and that the commercialization of Southwestern culture by the Harvey hotels and our own La Fonda, who profiteered off the narrative of the vanishing Indian. And let's not forget the alignment of this with federal Indian policy. At this time, the government was actively trying to take back reservations and assimilate Native peoples into the larger society. Preservation with a capital P officially begins in Santa Fe with the Planning Commission, who was charged in 1912 with understanding the national context of city planning. How fascinating that the commission was reaching out to landscape architects, not architects, as they were thinking more of the spaces between monuments, just as it was being planned in Washington, D.C. at the same time. As presented to City Council in December 1912, it is the opinion of this board that the preservation of ancient streets, roads, and structures is of the first importance, and that these monuments of the first Americans should be preserved intact at almost any cost, that neither climate, healthfulness, prehistoric ruins, nor scenery compare in value as an asset to Santa Fe with these relics of a romantic history, and that it should be the duty of all city officials to guard the old streets against any change that will affect the appearance or alter their character, such as widening or straightening. The commission developed a specific codification of the Santa Fe style, but it was less about preserving historic buildings of integrity than creating the stage set of this place. Through peer pressure and tax incentives, the style was encouraged, but not enforced, with occasional buildings like this straying far from the style until a breaking point was reached. Following a contentious debate between experts, not the people, one side wanting stylistic harmony and the other advocating stylistic variety, the side of harmony prevailed, culminating in the 1957 passage of the Historic Preservation Ordinance, clearly grounded in tourism, capitalism, and growth, rather than the perpetuation of the cultures of this place. This is where the old Santa Fe style is written into law, defining methods of construction and qualities of walls, color, massing, windows, doors, roofs, and allowances for equipment. The ordinance also defines a recent Santa Fe style, which today is indistinguishable from the old style. At one point in time, the deep culture of our place was reduced to a mathematical formula describing the ratio of wall to window, and aesthetics were clearly declared more important than the tectonic traditions of making or the preservation of actual historic places. Let's put this into context. At this moment, urban renewal was ravaging major American cities, including Albuquerque and Las Cruces. In 1963, plans to demolish Penn Station, seen here, in Manhattan were announced, leading to prominent protests, the galvanization of the larger preservation movement, and the 1966 signing of the National Historic Preservation Act, which rather than focusing on the style of new buildings like our ordinance, the NHPA instead developed a system of regulation based on historic integrity and authenticity that places buildings in a historic register following 4 criteria: A, significant historic events; B, significant historical persons; C, designed by historic significant architects; or D, potential to yield a historical information. Although much of the language in NHPA speaks to a broader understanding of culture, the register has long been a tool to reinforce and preserve heritage of the hierarchy, rather than the diversity of American culture. It does this by obsessing over monuments in the European sense, monuments that were designed and have been documented and that contain significant happenings, most unlike the vernacular place of Santa Fe. The Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties is, for most states and municipalities, the basis for managing change. Preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction are synonyms for most people, but in these standards mean very different things, each grounded in subtly different ways to protect historic integrity. Quite different from our original ordinance. Our ordinance subsequently grew through accretion and now provides rules for architectural style in 5 districts, as well as general guidance. The requirements for walls, color, materials, and other components are inconsistently framed and have led to extraordinary confusion about the intent and impact of preservation. Our current ordinance cherry picks from the Secretary's standards, adopting nearly word for word the standards that acknowledge buildings as a record of their time, the need to preserve distinctive craft and historic changes, and reversibility, while omitting altogether what many preservationists understand to be the 2 most important standards, those regarding appropriate use and differentiating new from old while being compatibility. Differentiation is about honesty and integrity, 2 qualities that risk exposing the myth of Santa Fe. Yet if we were true to the Adobe vernacular, differentiation is meaningless, as the mud-plastered surfaces have no tangible historicity from a material perspective, as they are always changing and always being replaced. The Secretary of Standards is no panacea. Its focus on design and tangible heritage belongs to an old-school preservation, which is about immutable relics from the past. More recent international conservation charters and newer heritage approaches are broadening perspectives to prioritize living culture over the historic past and the intangible over the tangible. A more recent International Heritage Declaration suits both the original intent of the 1912 Planning Commission and our current needs. Since the spirit of place is a continuously reconstructed process, which responds to the needs for change and continuity of communities, we uphold that it can vary in time and from one culture to another according to their practices of memory, and that a place can have several spirits and can be shared by several groups. When we focus on the preservation of the physical, we forget why we preserve. We shouldn't be doing it for the objects in the buildings themselves, but rather for this incredible web of intangible culture within which architecture represents place and is but a small component of culture. We just need to be brave enough to learn from the 2 most significant celebrations of culture here. Both Indian Market and Spanish Market prove that while tangible traditional works of art are certainly important, it is in fact the vibrant, intangible culture that bonds our communities together and allows them to adapt and thrive. it's time to question the appropriateness of so tightly regulating over 4,000 acres of our city in historic districts, enforcing design standards over the vast majority of the remainder of the city that only serve to trivialize the deep culture of this place. While we recognize and protect just 22 historic places outside the historic districts, only 22 places outside the historic districts are protected by the Santa Fe Preservation Code. We have an opportunity and an obligation in Santa Fe to revision preservation so that it serves to sustain the contemporary cultures of this place rather than commodify a stereotype. I believe that Culture Connects, the plan Estevan will discuss, is our gateway to a more authentic, dynamic, and resilient Santa Fe. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn. Am I audible?
Yes.
Unmute. Okay. So next up is Beverley Spears. Beverley founded Spears Architects in 1981. I apologize, I'm all over the place. Beverley founded Spears Architects in 1981, offering commercial and residential design, historic preservation, urban design, and landscape architecture. In 2011, now Spears Horn Architects was recognized by the American Institute of Architects as New Mexico Firm of the Year. Ms. Spears is the author of American Adobes and also Early Churches of New Mexico and Architect's View, both published by UNM Press. Beverley received the New Mexico Architects Medal in 2000 for contributions that have advanced the profession and the socially responsible role that architecture must perform within our greater society. In 2002, she was elevated to the National College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects. In 2003, she was honored by the Old Santa Fe Association for her contributions to the character and traditions of Santa Fe. So take it away, Beverley.
Okay, you can't see my screen, right?
It's all dark right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I did screen sharing. I don't know why it's not coming up.
Okay. Would you like me to share your slides for you?
Yes, I think you might have to because
Okay.
I don't know why it's not doing it.
Okay, we'll go back.
It says I'm screen sharing, but
How's that? Okay. I think we're all set. You can begin.
okay.
You'll just have to tell me when to advance.
Okay. So hello everyone, and I want to say I'm honored to be a part of this panel, and I want to thank Friends of Architecture Santa Fe for putting this together. I think it's a very important topic to look at. And thanks to the audience for zooming in and joining us. So the publication that I've selected to consider is Design and Preservation in Santa Fe, a Pluralistic Approach. This was done in 1977 by the City Planning Department. And this document's purpose was to delve much deeper into the unique form of Santa Fe and go way beyond the current thinking at that time regarding preservation, which was that all new and remodeled buildings should be done in Pueblo revival or territorial style, period. As background fieldwork for this study, the city hired 2 architects, Jim Hackler and me, for 6 months to go property by property, street by street, through the downtown area, noting and mapping urban design characteristics. This was a great job for a young architect. Very fun. Next. So the first chapter was by Harry Mull, and it looked at the basic urban structure of Santa Fe as it developed over time, with the plaza and a tiny grid of streets, the trails leading into Santa Fe, the river, and the acequias. This is very important information, but it's generally known among design professionals and preservationists here. Next, the second chapter, which for me was the most provocative, was by Carolyn Crayson, and it identifies and expresses the importance of three other key themes and their related motifs that are essential to the feel and character of Santa Fe. Next, the first theme is the mountain setting, which includes the mountain views and also hilly winding streets and native vegetation. The second theme is the labyrinth, which was the name given in this publication to Santa Fe's enclosed and defined public space. Unlike most American towns, public space here is contained and has articulated three-dimensional boundaries. Next, narrow offset streets, T-intersections. Next, building and walls directly at the street edge. The plaza. Next, zaguans, portals, and courtyards. These are all components of this very rich public realm. Next. So the third theme is a human intimate scale, and that relates to the first two themes. This human intimate scale is created by low buildings. Next. Small scale facades at the street edge. Portals. Next. Rich textures and building details. And next, intimate landscaping. So chapter 3 was by local preservation architect John Conran, and it lists and illustrated 22 diverse historic styles in Santa Fe, which is interesting, but not what we will dwell on today. The fourth and final chapter was by consultant William Wisemantel, and it divides the downtown area into unique townscapes based on neighborhood history, character, and urban form. He outlines a system for evaluating proposed development or changes based on the immediate context. This chapter laid the groundwork for the BCD townscape overlay districts that we have today and that you see here. So that's the document. It looked at Santa Fe apart from the mandated architectural styles in order to better understand what additionally makes Santa Fe unique and beloved. So I'd like to return to the idea of chapter 2, starting with the labyrinth, because I think that theme is the most powerful theme in the character of Santa Fe. This town is 410 years old, and the majority of those years were spent as a Spanish colonial or Mexican town. Next, our roots are essentially Mexican. I like to think of Santa Fe as the northernmost reach of Latin America. We need to protect not only the old buildings in the historic downtown, but also the Spanish colonial urban form. Next, which is the primary generator of the physical character of the part of our town which is acclaimed and beloved worldwide. But the historic districts form a very small geographic part of Santa Fe. Newer parts of Santa Fe should also reflect our mountain setting, our intimate enclosed urban space, and human scale, including handmade and vernacular elements. In recognition of our Spanish colonial origin, I feel strongly that we should limit height in Santa Fe to 2 stories, or at most a partial 3rd story. Building height is a major factor in all 3 essential themes of Santa Fe as identified in this report. Mountain views, enclosed outdoor spaces, and intimate human scale all rely on low buildings to achieve their impact. Next, my firm did a study of building heights in the historic districts for the city of Santa Fe in 1993. This drawing I did for the cover of the report shows the natural setting before Santa Fe was founded. the town during the Mexican period with low buildings and little vegetation, and finally what happened after it became part of the United States, taller buildings, but also many trees, most of which are invasive non-native Siberian elms. This brings up the topic of preserving cultural landscapes, which we should address. But back to height. Next. A building such as this, which is currently under construction on Cordova Road, has a huge footprint and 4 stories, and I think has no rightful place in Santa Fe. The style of this building tries to disguise its huge bulk, but nobody is fooled. And parenthetically, this building was developed by the Aberg Group, a company out of San Diego, which is part of the Midtown Campus development team on board to develop housing there. Next. Throughout the entire area of the city, we should be preserving and celebrating natural and historic features, including arroyos, native vegetation, ancient roads, and trails into the city, acequias, and long-established pedestrian pathways, our mountain setting, clean air, which we usually have, and dark night skies, which we used to have. They're historic and also prehistoric, and certainly worth preserving. And Mexican cultural roots include not only the urban form and architecture, but also the language, food, customs, and celebrations that make Santa Fe the unique American town that it is. Ironically, neither of the 2 popularly recognized architectural styles, Pueblo Revival, you should stay on that other, yeah, thank you. Pueblo Revival and Territorial reflect in their names their basic Mexican adobe building tradition. Okay, next. One of the few recent buildings in Santa Fe that has Santa Fe's characteristic labyrinthian space is the complex designed by Mexican architect Ricardo Legarreta on the former College of Santa Fe campus. It is possible to create complex contemporary buildings outside the historic districts that honor and continue what is unique about Santa Fe. Next. And one more of the complex. Thank you. I believe that computer-driven cars will provide new opportunities for a town less dominated by roads and parking lots. City leaders should pay less attention to traffic engineering standards and fire truck runways and more attention to improving the urban form and pedestrian realm. The bottom line is everything that is built or developed in Santa Fe should contribute to the unique character of Santa Fe. Next. And just as a final thought, I do think it is important to maintain our unique Santa Fe low, flat-roofed, tan stuccoed architecture, even with a very contemporary expression within the constraints. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Beverley. That was wonderful. As we make our transition to our next presenter, I just want to remind everyone that that Q&A window is open. Please do submit questions as they come up, and we will be working those into the discussion that follows. So it's really important that you get questions in there so that we can start getting them into the queue. Let's see. Next up, we have Mark Mitchell. I'm just making it a full screen and then sharing it. Apologize for the delay there. So Mark Mitchell is the current Cultural Preservation Director and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pueblo of Tesuque. Mark first served on the Tribal Council of Tesuque Pueblo in 1993. In 2005, he was appointed as the youngest governor of the Pueblo and served as governor 5 times since that time, in 2009, 2011, 2013, and 2017. He's a lifetime member of the Pueblo of Tesuque Tribal Council, and in 2009, he was elected as the chairman of the 8 Northern Indian Pueblo Council, for which he has held multiple positions. In 2013, Mark was appointed by the All Pueblo Council of Governors to serve on the Natural Resource Committee, of which he is currently co-chair, and as the commissioner of the 19 District Committee. So Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Thank you. Again, as I spoke earlier, to those of you that are listening and watching, welcome to the homelands of Tesuque Pueblo. Otherwise, we would have been known as Ogopogi. Again, the area of Santa Fe, the downtown area, and for that matter, the entire city and other areas are part and all our ancestral homelands of Tesuque Pueblo. So with that, you can go on to the screen there. So Ogopogi Uwinge, the place of the white shell. This story, oral story, comes from the elders from the Pueblo of Tesuque. And in it, there are all kinds of stories oral stories that come from this place. Some say it's a centerpiece for the Tanoan Tewa group, because the rest of the group of Tewa speakers are located, or would have been located, in the Galisteo Basin. Their footprints are still down there by way of ruins and by way of name places that we still have and we still acknowledge to this day. So again, in time immemorial, the indigenous communities have occupied the land and still do today. Across the country, from coast to coast, we know through oral history that our ancestors occupied this continent since time immemorial. Science, by way of carbon dating, can tell us the years. In our state, there are 23 tribes. We still practice our religion and speak our native language. Each tribe is unique and different. And there are 6 Tewa-speaking pueblos in the north, Tesuque being the furthest south. Ogopogi is Tesuque, and Tesuque is Ogopogi. And that word, Tesuque, is the Tewa title of our current pueblo, Tesuque, place of the cottonwood trees that grow in a narrow row. Our ancestors lived and built their lives here. There are still signs and other things that prove this fact. Next. Their ancestral homelands, this is a photo of the Santa Fe on Mount Baldy. Ancestral homelands comprise of not only mountain ranges, but also lowland desert areas. We show this photo because these areas are prime hunting areas. As hunters, these are the areas that our ancestors came for their quote-unquote grocery stores, their pharmacy, and other things that they needed to survive in the harsh climate of the north central New Mexico. Next. So by way of doing that, our ancestors, they're pretty smart people because they didn't have pen and paper, but they had the elements, they had the materials, and they had ways of leaving their marks on certain things. Like here in this photo, it depicts petroglyph rock art, and it shows that some of our folks were stargazers. They know the constellations, they know when things were happening as far as the solstices, summer solstice, winter solstice, etc. Next. Also, they were farmers, and in this specific rock art, it shows that they were growing corn. And you know, to this day, that's part of our sustenance, and we still grow corn to this day. Not only our pueblo, but other pueblos grow corn for the mere reason that we utilize the entire stalk and the ears as they come out, and as long as we got that, we can sustain ourselves. We show this depiction because, again, Pueblo people are diverse in whether they're farmers or hunters or warriors. That's kind of how our oral history goes, and these types of things, again, are evidence of human occupation by way of the ancestral Pueblonian people in the greater Southwest. Here is a photo of, again, the Mount Baldy, and this is during the summer months as the monsoons were coming in. I was unable to show you the cornfields that the Pueblo has, but the idea here was not only do our ancestors roam the area, they also have different unmarked graves, etc., that are out on the landscape. And in the foreground there, you could see the homes, and you could see along that small ridge there that there are folks living in rural areas, which sometimes they report things and other times they don't. Again, coming to our oral history, the oral history comes from our elders. Right now, those elders that I grew up with are all gone. They have passed on, but they left their advice, their storytelling, and their teaching, and they are embedded within our minds and in our hearts. And we try to teach this same teachings to our children who are now just learning the table language. But the elders in their time also learned from, while they were young in their time, they learned from their elders. So oral history was one way of keeping the traditions, the site names, and how the people came to be within the Southwest. But really, the indigenous peoples of this land, each have their own language, each have their own stories. This is but just one, and this is of Tesuque Pueblo, who would have been known as Ogapogi, White Chow people, but our ancestors left the area. Next. So again, Tesuque Uinge is our traditional name. For the Pueblo of Tesuque, our oral history puts us in what is now Santa Fe, New Mexico, well before contact from Europeans and the Spanish. And prior to us moving, our ancestors established their village here in Santa Fe. There are two other sites which are part of the original village or Pueblo, and they are, one is Pindi down in Agua Fria. Always refer that as LA1 and LA2. And the other one is located at the convention center. Per our oral history, they were placed there for defensive purposes of the larger village, which was located downtown, in the downtown area. So as far as the convention center construction during the year 2005, we always say that our oral history was strengthened during that phase of the construction there in downtown. Next. So I wanted to also show that a map of Santa Fe prior to occupation by Europeans or Hispanics, and this is one of them. I was looking for others, but I know, so hopefully I can paint a picture in your mind's eye that as you look at this photo or this map, the original Pueblo, Ogapogi, would have been centered right next to the, what is now the I think that's a sun symbol there in the middle. In that general area, there you go. And it came across the river and down some of the river. In this area, the people of Ogapogi thrived. There is a greater story that comes with the Pueblo people. And I believe we all share the same story, and that's of a migration story. But that's a different issue. And so this is how we got here, through that migration story. And again, through our oral history, this place was the center of the Tanoan people, the Tewa people, because of its location and the southern Tewas that were established back in the day in the Galisteo Basin, and also out in the Pecos area. And so I try to fix this photo. I believe it's a 1882 photo. Yeah, 1882. Again, it's just showing to make sure that everybody understands the geographical area and how things were built there in the city, and how Ogapogi members, or those people that came first, they knew things were going to happen. And through our stories, that's how they decided to up and leave. Next. Ogapogi, place of the white shell, is Tesuque, and Tesuque is Ogapogi. For this reasons, we must be conscious of our actions, planning, development of the city. For what lies underground yields the entire history of my people, the Pueblo people, their footprints, their evidence of occupation of the land. So with this, I just wanted to also say a little bit more as far as the history, or the unwritten history, as far as we know it through oral teachings. So when we learned about the ruins under the city, as I stated, we were baffled but surprised, and we brought this information back to tribal council here in Tesuque. And again, the evidence that was there, all they did was strengthen our oral history. Next. So in this depiction of the photos, again, it shows the cornstalk, and on the right hand side, there's a handprint. By way of reading petroglyph and rock art, usually the artist would sign by his hand, his or her hand, on the rock. So with that, I'm showing this photo here as other signs of Ogapogi. The entire area of the state is covered with evidence of Pueblo occupation, and also the landscape. And to bring to your all's understanding, the most famous one is Chaco Canyon Historic National Park, as part of the landscape occupation by Pueblo people. Also, there are other areas in states like Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, and as far west as California, pretty much the entire southwest of the continental United States. Next. So again, there is a lot going on out on the landscape. There are issues happening, and we have to bring attention to what's out there, because there are footprints of Native people, indigenous peoples out there, and we have to be cognizant as to what we're doing, how we're developing, what the land can yield and hold as far as population wise. And we must always understand that there are unmarked graves, there are other ruins that are yet to be found. And we want to make sure that these types and these things that are out there remain. Most recently, we've been holding consultations, and usually we inform people that prior to contact with the Europeans or the Spanish, wherever Native people expired, pretty much that's where they were buried. And so there are human burials all the way across the Southwest. That's why it's critically important that we understand the laws that are there to protect these things. And as we move forward in developing the city, we have to understand these things as we move forward. And we want to make sure that those footprints aren't erased, because our unborn also need to know these same things. And I think if we can do that, we can work together and move forward with having a sustainable community and development. With that, I want to thank you for your time and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was wonderful. One more reminder, please use the Q&A. We've got some great questions rolling in. Looking forward to the discussion to come. But before that, we have one more presentation, this time by Estevan Rael-Gálvez. So let me get it going and share. Okay. So anthropologist, historian, and cultural consultant, Dr. Estevan Rael-Gálvez is the former senior vice president of historic sites at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He also served as the executive director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center and as the state historian for New Mexico, and in that role as the chairman of the New Mexico Cultural Properties Review Committee. A native son of New Mexico with ancestral and living ties to both Native American and Indo-Hispano communities, he is currently completing his book, Bound: The Shadows of Native American Slavery and Its Legacy. His consulting firm is currently engaged in several initiatives, including developing community-based archives within Indigenous and Hispano communities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Estevan.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I want to first begin, buenas tardes. I'd like to begin by thanking Anthony, the Friends of Architecture, for hosting this really, really, really important conversation and the work that you've been doing to carry forward the dialogue. Lisa, you're a breath of fresh air. I've said this to you before, but I truly believe it in so many ways, and just think, hearing your comments and some of the comments that were threads in a few others, it made me think of one of my dear friends who's now passed on, who I learned so much from, Rena Swensel, who made this her home for many years, but who was also an architectural historian. That term doesn't actually hold the wisdom and the depth of knowledge that incredible person held. But you made me think of her, because she would always say, wherever we go, we leave our breath behind us. And so as I thought of you being a breath of fresh air, and in a moment when the world is struggling for breath, I want to dedicate this talk and my thoughts, at least, to those struggles, but also to recognize the promise with individuals like you, Lisa, and others who are thinking about what it means to revision, to look at differently, as we have in issues like preservation. Gosh, I want to just be able to respond to the 4 speakers that preceded me, but I will go on with some other things, because I believe that preservation as a discipline and as a movement, I'll hit next when I tell you. Lisa, thank you. Because I believe that preservation as a discipline and movement has developed in this nation and city to divorce the personal connection to place. Though Lisa has already introduced me, I want to begin by saying just a few words about my relationship with beyond the professional. We all belong to places in different ways. Are you maybe you're having trouble, Lisa, advancing? No? Yes? There you go. Thank you. We all belong to places that we live in, the places that we choose to make our home. But if we truly want to acknowledge place and its people and to create an invitation for others into this conversation, we must be willing to speak to how we are connected, not as a way to create hierarchies or binaries, but as a way to forefront the imperative and the importance of personal stories. Although I believe that there are many ways that we belong to place, each perspective, I believe, has meaning. In 100 Years of Solitude, one of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's characters says, "You belong to a place when you bury your dead." His wife, another, says, "No, you belong to a place where you give birth in a place." Shawn, I was thinking of you and Lisa raising children here as well. It's also a different way of belonging to place. As I think of this, although I'm a son of the Taos and the San Luis Valleys, I think of all of my ancestors that lived here. Hispanos, mulatos, colores quebrados, broken colors. I think of Doña Inés, the matriarch of the Martinez clan, a Tano woman who was once enslaved, but lived here her life all the way up through the 1600s. These documents, at least the 3 on your left, reveal her presence here. And I descend from her, as do thousands and God knows how many others. On the right is a 1790 census of people that were living here in Santa Fe, including Genízaros, broken colors, mixed colors, colors that were suspect as people were labeled. This is part of the vocabulary behind belonging as well. My connection also comes next from being married into a family whose stewardship here is as old as who is old, and who are among the very few who have been able to hold on to their land in a neighborhood that has been completely devastated by gentrification and displacement. The Rioses. I was thinking of what Beverley said, that this is a very Mexican town, and I thought of my father-in-law, Jesus Rios, on your right here. But the matriarch, the mama, was the one in the center here, Teresa Gabaldon. Belonging has always, who was a Gabaldon, but was connected ancestrally to a network of families, Cenas, Padillas, Chavezes. Belonging has always been defined here by the relationships that are especially defined by kinship, compadrazgo, and marriage, or at least in my case, partnership. Reimagining a preservation ethic must understand that places like Santa Fe are deeply layered and must account for the long memories of people, those who have long served as its stewards. In current practices around this work, the acknowledgement of place, there is a tendency to go to a point of origin, which is absolutely imperative. but it does not account always for the nuanced complexity of identity across time. What happens is that we erase what's in between all of these points, the 400 years, and that erasure is really problematic. I was asked, however, to speak really about Culture Connects next. Acknowledging our subjectivity is important to me, obviously, in this place, which is really, in many ways, at the heart and soul of what this document was all about. As Shawn said, many of these documents were about engaging, have been over time about engaging the tourist gaze, about engaging others who come to visit here, or even encouraging others to come and live here. I was very, very, very conscious, and I use the word very deliberately, not citizen, but this is a document for the residents, people who have chosen and who live here, and even those who no longer live here but want to live here but they've been moved away. So I want to give you a little bit of perspective and overview of Culture Connects. In 2015, Javier Gonzalez, then mayor, who noticed that I was working then with Mayor Riley in Charleston, South Carolina, in my role as at the National Trust, wanted to have a conversation about cultural plans for the city and what that might mean. And for those of you who have followed this, the cultural plans have been done globally and as a way to really understand assets in a city. But having just returned to Santa Fe in 2016 and developing a cultural firm, when the city did call for proposals for leading this planning effort, I submitted. Not being a big firm, I brought a very different approach and philosophy, drawing upon not only my work as a historian, understanding those layers and the people that come before, but as a cultural anthropologist and one who had worked in the field of culture for decades. I brought to the work an expansive view of culture that included arts and preservation, but interrogated what I saw as a troubling focus to what has become a focus on the creative economy for many of these cultural plans, which inevitably ended up focusing only on the residents. Next. So what did we do? We immersed ourselves in reading every single document that we possibly could get a hold of, including trying to find documents that were buried at the city that I couldn't seem to get a hold of, and policies about retirement and whatever had sort of imbued how we made this place across time. So it was a thorough document review, benchmarking. I looked at 7 other cities, including assessing the relationship of the arts to historic preservation. We looked at places big and small. I wanted to look at places like New Orleans, very different city, but also a colonial-based city that had also emphasized a lot of its creative economy based on tourism. I wanted to understand what those comparisons said to us here, what was missing. I wanted to dig into the city's investment. Although it was not easy to get data from various city departments, I assessed where there was investment, but also the research revealed the tremendous levels of disinvestment in certain sectors of the community. Trace briefly how the city, through policy and practice, shared where people lived and how in less than 50 years, the demographic shifts were dramatic across the city. Largely, I argued, or at least the data argued, because of race, ethnicity, and class. Where you lived could be marked by a class background. Next. My favorite part of this work, of course, was, oops, wait, did we miss something? Maybe go back. I'm missing a really important, how weird. There we go. This was my favorite part of doing the cultural plan. It was 12 weeks, thousands of people engaged. And of course, we went into museums and galleries and opera and in all of the traditional art spaces. But I jumped on buses, went into barbershops, went into bakeries. I wanted to push against the grain about where we think of where culture resides. We had countless dinners, or at least I had conversations at dinners and lunches at different people's tables and in kitchens. It was for me an incredible experience, and I was able to gather those voices that came from different sectors of the community, asking people where they felt the most comfortable. It was testing my own assumptions about these issues. I wanted to really try to understand where were the tension points, where were the opportunities, where were the promises. We did an object story gathering that Gomio here, just showing what object defined his place and his connection to place. Okay, next, where did we land? This next document that is embedded in the cultural plan was a statement of values. From all of the research, and particularly from the engagement component, we wanted to understand, what does Santa Fe, what do its people believe in? What do they value? The breadth and depth of its culture, the essential role of culture in advancing equity. Equity became such an important thread in having these discussions. The connectivity, the stewardship, and conservation. It's interesting, as we think about revisioning, we played with these ideas. Is preservation the right word? The impact of it as a culture, as an economic catalyst. The fundamental role of the well-being of people, and certainly its role in education. Next. What resulted also was a roadmap, recommendations, which were, it was distilled down from the research and the engagement, and it was organized around these 4 themes of people, practices, places, and policies, with distinct strategies, with recommendations, and with ideas. And so if you're interested in reading these documents, this document is available on the city's website. It can be placed in the Q&A. But these were ideas. They were, many of them, very good ideas. Some of them maybe not work, but they were meant as prototypes to really dig in. And so I want to just call out a couple of key issues that emerged for me. Maybe next, I can't remember if I have yes. Well, I think of what is important to understand about how it is all connected, and it is critical not to allow the solutions to be siloed. There are some key issues that emerged for me, at least as I was thinking about today's talk, relevant for today. Preservation must engage young people. As a community, I think one of the major things that emerged was we have to engage young people for every major issue. But as I think of preservation, this one especially, it's stuck in a certain age group. As a community, we often neglect to identify local youth, to see their potential, and to nurture their skills and their connections. Instead, where this city has focused its major policy work is to draw the youth and the creatives of other places. We can do that. It can be balanced, but we cannot neglect our youth. They are dying. They are literally dying, or they're moving away. And so preservation will die unless we engage our youth. We cannot avoid the housing crisis and its connection to the policies of historic preservation that have been a problem in terms of housing. They can be reimagined, but it has to be part of the solution. I am not a fan of the old model of historic districts at all. Let me be very clear and say it again. I'm not a fan of the model of historic districts, since they create hierarchies. And you can see it, someone showed a map on this. I would rather look at least what I learned from this engagement. We have to not look at districts, we have to look at neighborhoods all across the city. We often refer to even the south side or the north side or the east side. One of the things that I was corrected several times is you can't just look at the south side, because it's actually pretty diverse, class, race, etc. in the south side. This is why we have to actually look neighborhood by neighborhood. Can say more about why I'm not a fan about historic districts. We have to recognize the inequities and historic traumas that have long defined this place. The solutions often get framed in narrow black and white issues. But we must be able to recognize the complexity, the nuance, the preservation, and the ordinance that froze this city in place has privileged the elite over the plebe, over the people. This was never meant to be a static document. It was meant to continue to live on and change and iterate and build on, take one idea and try it out, prototype. If it doesn't work, recalibrate. I've been fortunate over the past few years since the plan went out to have partners and supporters like the, I'm coming to an end. I hope I'm not going over too much, Lisa, but partners and supporters like the McCune Foundation and partners like my IAIA, the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, and Little Globe, in taking some of the ideas and moving forward. Certainly on one of our projects, Presente here we had members of our community ensemble performing Agapoge, which was spectacularly beautiful. We are living with these memories and the troubling memories, but we also have to continue to think about how arts and preservation and all of these issues can help us provide pathways to get to the other side of these things. In thinking about the document and preservation for this in this city, I will remember a speech given by Paul Goldberger, who we were able to get to serve on the board of the Philip Johnson Glasshouse when I was at the Trust. He said, "I don't believe that preservation is necessarily a precept to freeze a building in its current state. Maintaining a building precisely as its original architect designed is a useful safety net, preventing egregious and offensive renovations, but it also denies a building the chance to live and to evolve, to respond to changing circumstances." I would say the same of our city, of any city. The statement is a counter to how the ordinance created not only a frozen monument of a city, but one that was wholly imagined, as Shawn so ably pointed out, and Lisa. Goldberger's statement is nothing new to the people of this place who have been stewards, like Rena, like Mark, like my grandmother, who viewed the built environment and and countless other men and women of this place who year after year took mud in their hands to ensure that a building would breathe, but when it needed to also let it melt back into the earth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Estevan. That was beautiful and important. I am going to now introduce Rachel Preston Prinz, who's our moderator for this evening, for our discussion. Let's see. I thought I had to cut the slide up, but I don't. I'm going to share this slide while I introduce Rachel. So Rachel Preston Prinz is an architecturally trained designer and preservationist who has spent the past 20 years working in sustainable architecture, historic and cultural preservation, and placemaking. Rachel holds a master's in architecture and a certificate of historic preservation from Texas A&M. She is the founder of the hybrid architectural preservation and storytelling practice, the Ministry of Architecture, and is known for her TEDx and Pechacucha talks about architecture and place in New Mexico and beyond. Rachel is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and dot connector, working to confront New Mexico's architectural mythology in order to rediscover and celebrate the forgotten principles underlying our 1,000-year tradition of sustainable design. So now I think we'll move. We're really excited to have Rachel here to moderate our discussion. Gayla, if you could switch us to grid view, I'll stop sharing my screen. But maybe we can go to gallery view now. Did that work in gallery view? Are you seeing what I'm seeing?
We see you.
Okay, excellent. No, you see me.
Yes.
Let me get to the grid. I'm gonna let Gayla, our tech wizard behind the scenes, get us to gallery view. I'm seeing gallery view. But maybe if Gayla can unspotlight me, because we want to see everyone's faces. Okay, so we are on grid. Yes. Okay, Rachel, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here with this incredible panel of experts and passionate advocates of design and architecture in Santa Fe. I think we have an amazing collection of questions coming in. I really appreciate that. But I wanted to touch on just a few things that I wanted to ask some of our presenters that I think will weave in some of the questions that you've asked. And while we're still here on having just freshly talked about Estevan's work on the Cultural Connects project, I wanted to touch on just a few questions or sort of opportunities within that and to create a dialogue between the city and the way that it's going to move into the future and Estevan's work and the way that it might work as a living document. Estevan, this will mainly be towards you to this one, but then we'll start to broaden this question. The Culture Connects document makes a mention of many, many places, and the plaza is probably mentioned maybe 100 times with all of the survey responses. And certain places get a lot of attention, as they always have in Santa Fe. Architecture as a concept in itself has been is mentioned several times. But there isn't really a language that talks about the intersections between the architecture and the place and the people as much as some of the stuff that Shawn and Beverley have spoken on tonight. And I'm wondering if this is something that you think is it a new thing, these connections? Is it something that we forgot, the relationships between these spaces and our relationships to the landscape? Or is it something that that really is part of our culture and that really needs to be woven back into the language that we're using to speak about these things?
Rachel, that's such I love that question because maybe we have forgotten the language, but the language has actually been scripted already. It's there. I wasn't thinking until I heard Lisa of bringing up Rena Swenzel and
Oh,
others.
yeah.
Isn't the first one, but and she would be the first to acknowledge that. But there's books of this language. Beverley mentioned it, that the report that she reviewed talks about the interconnections between the built environment and the natural environment. And Shawn spoke about the connection of those two environments to the intangible environments. I loved his graphic of like the craziness of the matrices that show the intangible. Those words, the intangible and the tangible, we already have the vocabulary. Let's just start prefacing it a little bit more. Let's also lose some of the language that actually is an obstacle to those connections, like prehistory. Yeah, I was a huge advocate, as Mark will remember, on the CPRC of like, oh my God, if I hear that word again, my head is going to explode, because it creates a hierarchy in time. And I think we have to examine those words that are not useful to the connections, but also pull to the forefront the words that are useful.
That's perfect. And to turn that back around, and I really appreciated what Mark said. I really love understanding this place a little bit more in our relationship to the landscape, especially now that Beverley has touched on that. But this also is sort of a reverse of cultural connects. We see the description in the actual document that you produced. It says, when asked what culture feels like, two different interpretations emerged. First, feel. Oh, feel was associated with touch, mud brick, a blanket, a fire, woven rugs, chilly ristras, air, earthy, crisp, and a tight hug from a family member who you have not seen in ages. I love that quote. That's so powerful. Second, feeling was also equated with sentiment and included answers like wonder, holy, welcoming, grounded, confusing, comfort, free, startling, justice, kindness, community, and ancient. Tying this into the work that Shawn and Beverley and Lisa have been doing with the historic registers and the National Register, if we want to capture more of our culture, so feeling is also one of the criteria for the National Register. It's one of those kind of intangible things that we can talk about. And is it something that we want to, if we want to capture more of our culture, do we need to start looking at whether we add language to the National Historic District and the rest of the city that captures feeling? Does this need to become part of our architectural lexicon? That we start to have this conversation so that it ties into what we really are about and why it's National Register worthy and why it's world worthy?
First, Rachel, thank you for reading the addendum, because that's where of Culture Connects, that's where the real stuff is. It's so
juicy.
Oh my God, it really is. And I don't know many people who have dug into that. So thank you for actually pulling out some bits and pieces. And now I don't even think I still have stacks of paper that may not have even made it into the addendum, because there were so many loose ends and threads. So thank you. Yes, that's really important to actually draw from that, because that was the intention. Shawn encouraged us to think about documents like the National Register, or how we think about those things, and to interrogate them now. We're living in a moment where it's important to work on thinking of what does integrity mean in the first place, right? What is, even the words that we love, intangible, like real, I mean, there's some really good language, UNESCO and others that have thought about that, but I think we can work within the rubrics of those documents, and I think there's some room to push around, as you've suggested. But I also think that we have the opportunity, we have the responsibility to actually interrogate them even more. Because what has been revealed, and others have said this better than I have, is that the National Register, even the state registers, don't reflect these communities fully.
That's right.
You know, I had the privilege of serving on Secretary of the Interior's Advisory Council for Latino Sites, and also advising on the LGBT one. And it's pretty amazing. We know the statistics, right? Like less than 3% of those sites reflect women. Less and an equally small number reflect people of color. And that is why it's important to interrogate these documents. You went a little bit deeper in terms of really taking an issue like feeling, which is part of how we can think about these nominations. And certainly we can do that, but I think it's the issues and the problems are more systemic.
That's actually exactly. I'm a systems thinker, and that's exactly what I was thinking. There are so many incredible documents here that have never spoken to one another, and so many architects and preservationists who have never spoken to one another about these issues that they've been working on. And it seems like we need to sort of usher in a systemic change. And that's what some of these questions are really trying to get to the heart of.
I think we want to really interrogate that, because a systemic approach in many ways applies a universal approach. And that is, in my mind, absolutely what is wrong with the vast majority of international preservation charters, this idea of universal heritage value, which is completely inappropriate, particularly in a place like Santa Fe, where we're surrounded with tribal communities whose value systems might be radically different from one another, let alone those of Santa Fe. And I think what's exciting to me to think about, some of the questions that I saw kind of flitting through around this idea and the notion of feeling, is that the notion of feeling and place is going to be radically different from one neighborhood to the next. And so what I think we need to do is just throw the whole damn thing out in terms of the ordinance, because it's never been washed of the white anthropologist who established it, and it's a hierarchical, dominating, view. And what we should be embracing is ideas of place that might, in Santa Fe, that might be radically different from one neighborhood to the other across the street. We embrace our differences rather than try to legislate them away.
I totally agree with you, Shawn. I think this is a really, really complex perspective as someone who's charged with representing the system of law that we have to regulate our built environment. And just in and of itself, zoning is a system that requires a level of hierarchy, at least the traditional prescriptive zoning that Santa Fe has embraced over the years. This notion that we have a set of criteria, prescriptive criteria, that are applied equally under the law. But you see within our own preservation regulations, the introduction of subjectivity in the notion of what is harmonious to you, what is harmonious to another person. This idea of harmony, which actually, it has its roots in sort of imposing order, both physically and morally amongst people. I think that what we have here is a bridge to saying, actually, harmony is something, if we can move from harmony into a place of what do we value for the built environment? What do we value in terms of cultural preservation? How is the built environment just one component of cultural heritage that, again, as I said in my presentation, has to be lived to be really preserved or conserved? And it recognizes that there is this great variety of values that are represented in our community that are held equally, or that can be held equally, that can be, you can have differing truths held simultaneously. I wonder, Mark, if you have any thoughts on that.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, I'm multitasking here because I'm scheduled to be at another meeting with the Forest Service at 8 o'clock.
Okay.
So I'm trying to multitask here, but there's a lot of issues right now, and we're going to have to decipher and work through all of it. Points well taken on the issue, but I think if we can engage the communities and move forward with that, I like the dialogue regarding the codes and what have you that the city has, and we have to make sure that we live up to the name City Different as far as tourists and others are concerned, because that's what we are. We are City Different. There's a bunch of folks from different backgrounds, and we all come together in this place. And now you know that Tesuque is Ogopogi and Ogopogi is Tesuque. We have a few say in as to how things are unfolding when it comes to development, because I think we need to follow the law of NAGPRA and ARPRA, so that we can make sure that those footprints of the ancestors that have long gone aren't sitting in a box someplace in a museum. And to us, that's not right. I wonder if we can work through that process to make sure that these human remains who were once alive, who were interned and buried wherever they were buried, that they stay there. That's critical on our end, but as we move on the discussion, I think that we can elaborate a little bit more as we move along, but I like the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, in respect of your time, if I might jump in on just a few questions that we had for you and that have come up for you, so that you may leave to get to your next meeting as necessary. So you mentioned something that was really intriguing to me in your presentation, and it never occurred to me that the connections might be made, and maybe you can help us understand them. But so there's always the story that underneath the oldest house is an old pueblo, and the end. Is that something that we should be understanding as being connected to Ogopoge and to your people?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Yes. That's so cool.
Because again, the city was built upon the ancestral ruins of Ogopoge. Nobody really knows about that, and now you're learning about it. So how does that impact everybody? That, oh wow, now we know this. Holy moly! And the thing that I'm worried about is, as a former law enforcement officer, we enforce looting. We enforce this part of it. So how do we know that people, now that they know, how do we know they're not going to do this in their own backyards? Right. To me, that's kind of worrisome, as for the reasons stated before. Those are the footprints of our ancestors. And, who knows whether if human remains could talk, they would say, I'm from wherever, or say, wait a minute, I'm native. No, Hispanic from wherever, or I'm Anglo from, but they don't. We still have the same respect for all the human remains, no matter who they are or where they come from. We just want to make sure that, to us, it's sacrilegious to pull somebody's remains out. And maybe that's, one of the things that the general public needs to know. I know on our end, as governor, we were trying to add teeth to the NAGPRA law, the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act, for that fact. because it's a misdemeanor at this point. And so, we would much rather see somebody get jail time for doing things like this, because in current day society, and we pose this question to the powers that may be, and we ask the question about, if I were to go to the current day cemetery and do that, what are the consequences if I get caught? Why doesn't that same law apply to historical? But, we haven't found that bridge to cross yet, and we're looking for it. But nevertheless, I hope that you all understand where the Pueblo is coming from.
Definitely understood. It actually makes me think of something Estevan said about how one of the ways that you can belong in a place is to bury your dead there, to give birth there, and if we're exhuming bodies of your ancestors, are we breaking a relationship with the land that's really crucial?
That's a very good point.
For us, the fear is, we look at it down the road, the future, say 50 years, 100 years from now, it's just going to be on paper.
Right.
They once lived there, here, but we don't want to have that. We want to show that they're still there. Mm-hmm. It's what our concept is, our thought process.
Mark, you've touched on the treatment of remains aspect of it, but do you have any other actions that you think are necessary for future development that honors and respects traditional culture?
Yes, consultation, meaningful consultation between government to government, city government, state government, federal government, county government, because without that, again, those footprints that I say will be erased in perpetuity, and there's a new road, there's a new highway. We already experienced that in current days. I experienced that just within, just outside of our boundaries of the reservation, and the sites are no longer there. There's a road, somebody's house is being constructed in the area, and our hands are tied. We try to outreach to the local powers that may be, whether it's law enforcement or other, but that's as far as we got. And as we found out, we need to make the changes. But on our end, you have to understand the tribe, Tesuque. We're not about disclosing locations. We're not about disclosing any of this stuff for the mere reason that somebody's going to go out there and loot the area. And we've had that done before. And it's extremely hard to investigate something like this. And the duration of that takes about a year or two before if we ever find who did it. But in the meantime, progress is moving, and somebody says, well, I got to get my house. I already paid the contractor, etc. And lo and behold, it is what it is, and we're trying to fix it. But again, it all boils back down to government to government, meaningful discussions, and the folks that are developing understand that there are issues, especially in the Southwest, and anybody who comes into the Southwest, whether it be in our state, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, wherever, these things have to apply. My thoughts.
When we were doing the convention center and so much archaeology was uncovered and the archaeologists worked there, I don't know what it was, Mark, it seemed like a year, maybe it was only 6 months, but they uncovered an enormous amount of Pueblo construction as well as human remains. But being on the architectural team for the convention center, we wanted to leave a portion of the exposed walls visible and maybe under glass, even under a glass floor, to really show all of Santa Fe that there was a civilization here before Santa Fe existed. But we weren't, that was not the choice of the Pueblos to allow that to happen.
No, and there's reasons why, which internally we have traditional unwritten laws that prohibit us from disclosing that information. As long as it's on paper that the city government and the tribal government came to terms and found a happy medium, we're satisfied with that.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Thanks, y'all. So Shawn posed a question earlier to me and to Lisa that was very intriguing to me, and I thought I might start to dial in on a couple of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A that this ties into. And the question is it too late to revision preservation to serve the people of Santa Fe? And I just want to give a little bit of background on this. One of the points of this series is to examine ongoing shifts towards more equity and inclusion in historic preservation practice. I think we've done a really good job looking at the past peoples of this place. But are we ignoring the people that live and work here now, but have been excluded by gentrification? Are they participating in these conversations? Now, we know that they're participating in Estevan's conversations, but maybe they're still being overlooked. And let me give you an example of how this comes into an architectural point of view. So there was a study of family compounds that was done some years ago, and it paid sort of a passing glance to our centuries-old tradition of doing the way that we've built, but it really focused on 20th century landscape and building types as a model. Shawn pointed out that this was also happening in the 1912 minutes. But as I've walked around and surveyed the historic districts for some of my projects, I was surprised to discover that there are at least a dozen types of complexes, including small apartment complexes right in the city. The reality is that most of the people who lived here and worked here when they first got here, they would rent a room in a larger compound. But we've moved to a single family residential model in the 20th century. And I'm wondering if instead of studying compounds as a style, if we studied them as a pattern, if that would offer us more opportunities to have a more affordable, sustainable, historically correct version of Santa Fe that's more accessible to more of our people. And the question then becomes, is there a resistance to bringing back younger, less affluent people to the historic district, or is that just an accident of focusing on focusing so much on the outside view? Is gentrification an accident, or is it intentional? And is it being maintained accidentally or intentionally? And then we're still going to start talking about some of the conversations about the heights of buildings and sustainability in general. But I just kind of wanted to get a feel for you guys on that one.
I could say something about that. I think in general, our old neighborhoods, whether it's South Capitol or East Side or West Side Guadalupe, because they have old buildings, because they have character and history and variety, they are very desirable. And when something is desirable, the price goes up, it gets gentrified. And that doesn't mean anybody gets moved out, but property values go up. And so people with more money buy into those neighborhoods. But it's because those neighborhoods physically are so wonderful.
To me, what was exciting about reading the 1912 Planning Committee meeting minutes was that it was not about regulation. It was about incentives. And to me, that, in my question of is it too late, I think it very well might be in the plaza area. Mm-hmm. But I think that incentives rather than regulation are really the only tool we have left that might allow for something that you just so eloquently argued for, Rachel. I think that's really beautiful, the idea of how do we get varied income into the plaza area. I think we do that through incentives. We do that through zoning. I don't think it's too late in the rest of the city for preservation, but I think preservation might be the wrong word. And I think what we need to be thinking about is how do we sustain neighborhoods, and how do we sustain communities, because that's about living, breathing people rather than dead buildings. And of course we can do that. We can do both, but we have to be measured about it. And I was shocked to really dig into the statistics of preservation. I think I stated it twice in my talk that there's like 22 buildings outside of the historic districts that are individually listed. That's nuts. And we have an incredible obligation to really reach into the communities across the city to figure out what are the places they hold dear, and not to freeze them in the past, but how do we help them sustain those places? And there's an incredible toolbox that's being developed across the country. We're looking at legacy businesses and other things that are not, again, about the physicality of a place, but about preserving the intangible relationships that place holds.
I want to be able to speak to the issue of intention. I'm looking at some of the questions as well, and someone noted that my comment about historic districts was, it was not, they were not created as an oasis as someone wrote, the perros grandes, for the elite, as I suggested. Maybe they weren't, but there are unintended consequences, to be sure, to all of I actually think there were both. There were intended consequences. There were policies put in place that Shawn went over, Lisa went over, one of those being the ordinance, that were intentional in terms of the outcome, in terms of pushing people out. I think retirement policies that were developed early on during Mayor Pick's administration. I think there were policies even under Mayor Gonzalez's administration to make this city young. That was a policy implication that had consequence, right? And I think part of it was to focus on bringing young people in, which also happened in 1912 as part of the arts movement, that forced people, forced them out, but it was intentional to bring people in, right? Intentional. Where are they going to live? They're going to live on the east side. And that happened. And so there were unintended and intended consequences of all of these policies, including the development of historic districts. What Shawn just suggested, I think, is really, really smart in terms of thinking about the rest of the community. The survey that Beverley mentioned, in terms of thinking of all those houses, all the work that John Conran did in thinking about the different styles, I wonder if that was done, if that could be done. Of course it could be done in different parts of the city. But I also want to interrogate, like, how are we thinking about what is historic in the first place? And what is beautiful? I want our community to define those issues in their own neighborhoods, not for those of us who were bureaucrats or policymakers making those decisions. It should come from the community itself.
I love those comments, Esteban. It's certainly something that I've been thinking about in trying to reframe how we practice administering the ordinance and how we expand our mission beyond that. And part of it for me involves working across departments, across missions. So with the Arts and Cultural Department, with the Office of Affordable Housing, with the Office of Economic Development, so that we can move beyond just thinking about the built form and thinking about its implications, and the implications of overemphasizing the built form. But I also want to say a couple of things. for me, the idea of neighborhood stabilization or somehow keeping neighborhoods alive in a way that incentivizes families to stay, but also keeps in mind for the struggles of retaining a home that maybe you can't afford to maintain any longer, or that takes into account the reality of the added expense of preservation and the real estate market that has created incredible pressures in our historic neighborhoods. On that note, I just want to pause for a second and note that it is 7:30. I wonder if everybody is okay to keep going just for a few minutes, because this conversation feels like it's just getting going. I know, Mark.
Another 2 hours.
Another 2 hours will be fine. I know, Mark.
We'll figure it all out.
I know Mark has to step away at least by 7:45.
Yeah, by 7:45, I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Want to give that announcement to our panel and to our audience as well, that we'll just be going a little longer than we had originally scheduled.
I'd like to touch on just coming back to that point that you were just making, Lisa. It's really it echoes a question that Carlos Gomorra asked on the Q&A that he directed to Beverley, and I think also really kind of goes to a lot of us. With a growing, morphing, changing population and city, how do we balance preserving low building heights while also trying to grow in such a way that is inclusive, compact, non-sprawling, and walkable? How should we continue, change, or evolve the historic districts in a way that expands socioeconomic equity? How should we continue, change, or grow the non-historic districts in a way that reflects the historic district design standards, but also which keeps building costs feasible economically? What do you guys see?
Well, okay, so that is a hard question. But one thing that people do not talk about that I think is critical is, what is the optimum size of Santa Fe? Are we trying to grow this into a city of 500,000? If we are, then we need to increase housing. We need to increase jobs. We need to develop more. But is that what we want? And what are the results of doing that? Or do we want this town to remain maybe the ideal size for this town based on all the considerations is 150,000 based on our water, etc. But nobody talks about that. There's this kind of unspoken urge to grow, more jobs, more housing, more roads, more neighborhoods, more development, and greater height. But I think we need to look rationally at where that leads, and is it really what we want? What are we trying to create here?
I think that's an excellent point, but we have to do it with the lens of equity on the very top of that examination, because right now, the very people that we need to run this city, to the essential workers who we've all depended on so desperately for the last 6 months, they can't live here.
That's right.
And that's not right. And,
unless they've already got theirs.
So how we allow ourselves to grow to enable that equity without endlessly growing is a question I don't know the answer to.
Yeah, and it's also
we've got to get at.
Because the more we grow and the more we do affordable housing, it may help the problem in the short term, but it doesn't solve it on the long term, because that demand keeps growing. It's like you look at LA, it's huge, it's unmanageable, but housing is still extremely expensive, and workers who mow lawns or whatever are commuting 2 hours away.
Mm-hmm.
That's important.
And more is not necessarily, it doesn't solve the problem in the long term.
Beverly, thank you.
Beverly, to remember that there's not one solution. This is a complex problem. It's going to involve multiple solutions from multiple different directions. But I also think it's important to recognize that sort of to grow or not to grow is not really the question we are growing as a community. I think the recent numbers are that somewhere upwards of 50% more people moved into the state of New Mexico than moved out in the past month. And there's this COVID migration that's going on right now. So we're going to see wave after wave of people moving here. But it is more, I think for me as a city employee and as a resident who's raising my kids here and trying to afford my house, I just feel that if we take the attitude that we have to stop growth, it's not really gonna solve the problem either. So it's more about how. It's about framing the how in a way that's rooted in community values. It's rooted in a vision that we have for ourselves. And for me, going back to our last session on revisioning planning, I really think that has to start with a new general plan, a new policy, a grounding policy document for the city of Santa Fe that really speaks to a broad scale vision of how we want to grow moving into the future. Because our general plan, which is our guiding policy document now, is over 20 years old, and we're a much different community now than we were 20 years ago. So,
I want to chime in a little bit before I go.
sure.
In reference to this discussion, again, as I stated earlier, I believe that a government-to-government discussion regarding the development of the city would need to happen. These things need to be looked at on the holding capacity, so to say, as the city is growing. Is there enough water? Is there enough space? Because we all talk about space and elbow room, and we want to do this and we want to do that, but there are laws out there that we need to adhere to as well. Natural resources is a big issue. So these things, components, we all have to think outside the box. And how do we do that? Somebody said we need to bring in the community, and when we do that, leaders have to understand that everybody has their thought process, their points of views, and how do they articulate bringing all that together to satisfy the wants and needs of the general public, by also looking at where are our boundaries in referencing the law and referencing all the other things that we just talked about. Preservation, I talked about the preservation of my ancestors' footprint out on the landscape. That's critically important to the tribe. So ergo, I think this discussion is going to continue on. So we got to find that happy medium somewhere. And we really have to look at the natural resources. If they're there, fine. If not, then how we're going to maneuver things. And we always say that our children are our resources, and we can't send them off anywhere else to college, or we try to keep them in state. But we as leaders, we need to really sit down and talk and make sure we discuss those hard issues. Because as a leader, I am not going to satisfy everybody. I know that for a fact. But, as long as we address the issues and we look at all the issues that are before us, and that we've done our due diligence, not personal gain, but community gain, is what we should be looking at. So I know it's kind of getting my time to jump off. I wish you all well. Thank you for having me on. I'll be around Santa Fe. I'll be probably at City Hall whenever all this is happening. Please stay safe. Follow the directions of the CDC, and it applies to all of us. And understand that, we'll get through this. Have faith. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Good luck tonight.
Thank you. Be safe, all.
You too.
Can I touch on just something that Mark just brought up, just very briefly? And I want to talk to Estevan about it, especially, but I'm also very curious if you other guys have some comments on it. And specifically, it's something that Estevan brought up when we were originally talking about doing this panel. And he said, is there anyone who's missing from the conversation? And that really intrigued me, because one of the things that for me, what is a major factor that's missing in our ability to be sustainable is our relationship to water. We've cut off our acequias, and the river flow sometimes is and sometimes isn't. Some of our wells are running dry because so many people have dropped straws into our aquifer, and we're using systems that aren't replenishing the aquifer fast enough. And the only people who now get to enjoy the microclimate and ecosystem that come from our natural resources like water are the people who can afford to live in that neighborhood. And Esteban has spoken about the need to reconnect to our cultural traditions, and I'm really interested. I did an acequia rehabilitation plan for the town of Taos, which they're now implementing, and it's been amazing to see these acequias that have been running dry for dozens of years, decades, some cases now running, and to have been a part of that, and to see the community kind of pick that up and really start to run with it and restore these acequias so that they're working correctly and that the ecosystem is preserved. And I'm wondering, Esteban, in your work with Culture Connects, and the mayordomos, do we have any hope for that natural resource, or is it too late? Do you know?
I don't know that I know, but I certainly I will echo what Shawn said a while ago, that in spite of, it's important that we raise these questions of whether it's too late, but because it should force us to actually think about those issues in a harder way toward a solution. I think I'm both idealist and pragmatist at the same time. I think asking the question that Beverley asked about growth is important, and it helps us think about those issues of the natural resources, whether it's the water, whether it's the land, whether the capacity of the land to hold people. But there are different filters to think about these things. And certainly where Shawn and Lisa went in answering that question was the other filter is the community itself, children, equity, all of those issues. They're equally as important, because certain communities have closed growth down and close their neighborhoods down to no more growth because and they didn't look at issues of equity, and that's what has been the result. That is what has resulted in gentrification and displacement. But I as we were looking at Culture Connects, people started talking about the story of that ditch that used to run there, and it's not an accident, or it's not it's a truth when people say the water is life in this land. And it's so interesting I've been walking my dog in different parts of the city because I'm just trying to give my little dog different experiences. And when we walk in Canyon Road, near the river, it's often flowing. Now, I don't know the policies. If we walk over here closer to West Alameda, closer, down the river, it almost never is flowing. And when water is flowing in a community, whether in the river, which feels like a ditch sometimes, or the other ditches, there's a vitality that gets created. And mayordomos are part of that ecosystem that is an ancient system here in other places that actually helps sustain those communities. We should do an inventory of those acequias that are no longer running, the ones that used to run through Midtown, and start to think about what would it mean to bring that water back. I don't know. We have to ask the questions.
I think the city is in some ways quite an offender when it comes to preservation. I'm thinking you're talking about the river, Estevan. The city has, first of all, nobody talked about urban renewal, which we had in Santa Fe, which wiped out old Hispanic adobe neighborhoods or neighborhood. And we ended up with the Hilton and wide streets and a very wide bridge. You don't even know you're going over the river there at Sandoval. But going over the river you should be aware that you're going over the river. It should be a notation or a commemoration or something instead of it being totally hidden. Some of our bridges are great and you know you're going over a bridge. Others, it's just like the road just goes right on. Mm-hmm. And the city has done a lot of things with intersections and road widths that destroy the character of the neighborhood. And they've done it over and over, and neighbors have fought. They've fought paving dirt streets, they've fought widening bridges, and typically they lose.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for touching on that, Beverley. It actually touches one of the questions that J.D. Scott asked. He said, how do we balance the urgent need for dense, affordable housing with the prevailing preference for low-rise development? Is it ethical to prioritize, it just moved. Is it ethical to prioritize views, a luxury, or a privilege over shelter, a fundamental human right? How can we claim to oppose car-driven development, which you were just talking about, with exploring ways to densify the city?
You know, the areas around downtown are extremely dense. They're like 7 dwellings per acre as compared to the growth since then, which tends to be more like 3 or 4 dwellings per acre. And yet the neighborhoods around downtown are low. They're typically 1 or at most 2 stories. They're very desirable and very livable. People have small patios, but most families have a little piece of ground they can call their own and go out and plant something. To me, it's a critical part of Santa Fe is that you're connected to the earth and that we can see the sky and that we can see the mountains. And we can have a fair amount of density and still not go up.
I don't think it's reasonable to say we can't go up anywhere. It's interesting to watch in the chat how many people have raised objections to Capitol Flats.
I was just about to bring that up.
I think we can argue with this. You can argue with the architectural style of it. But if there was a place close to town where we can achieve some height, that's it. And I personally don't have any problems with the height there. I mean, if it blocks a view from a few places, but it's adjacent to transit, it's adjacent to bike paths, and that's how we have to deal with development so that we can minimize the use of the automobile.
On that note, Shawn, it is also adjacent to state government offices that are approximately the same height. So it's sort of matching the fabric that's already in the immediately surrounding area. I mean, I think there are ways to achieve additional height, even in our historic districts, without disrupting low architecture. It's all about the how. Again, I don't like questions where you have to choose either or. I'm a both and kind of person.
Right.
And I really think that this is where community-based design can really help us. And looking at past models of multifamily developments that fit into a single family residential, mostly suburban residential model. I think I can think of a handful developments from the 50s and 60s around the historic districts that do achieve increased density without and increased moderately increased height without going huge within that. So I think that it's about scale, it's about appropriate design, and it's about incorporating these questions of equity that come from the community.
We have an incredible opportunity with Midtown, the campus, to achieve some real density, to achieve some height in ways that really don't impact existing residential neighborhoods. And we're fools to not take advantage of that.
We can achieve enormous density. That's 64 acres. It can accommodate an enormous number of dwellings and not go over, say, 3 stories. I mean, my firm was one of the firms that did the studies, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we came up with amazing density by using the Santa Fe urban outdoor labyrinth model, and so that the outdoor spaces are all positive and usable. There's not just sort of vague space floating around tall buildings. So it is possible.
Right. I think one of the most beautiful things that you said a few minutes ago, Beverley, was about the importance of us connecting to the earth. And I think that's the key issue, and it's density that allows us to create open space, to make sure that we have equitable access to the earth.
I agree with that statement, Shawn. I'm also looking at Jake Barrow's.
I was just about to point that out.
Sorry, I'm taking over.
It's all good.
Today, where he suggests that we can start thinking about the entire city and the surrounding area and not get so focused on historic districts. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And I think for me, even calling them historic districts personalizes them. They become districts which are collections of structures rather than neighborhoods where people live. I mean, I think even just the terminology implies a coldness and a lack of acknowledgement of the living nature of neighborhoods and how they grow and evolve and change. And at its core, I really do believe historic preservation is a project not about freezing in amber the built environment that we have that has historic origins, but it's about managing change in a way that aligns with our values, that retains what's important from the past and allows our neighborhoods to grow and evolve into the future. And that is just the way I look at historic preservation. And again, I kind of cringe at those words, but it is what we're calling it still. But I don't want to take over too much, and I know it's getting late, so I don't know, Rachel, if it's time to
I can say one thing.
Yes.
As you continue to do the work that you're going to do on revisioning preservation, and I've already said how much I'm glad that you're at the helm doing that. I think it's important to think, as Shawn just said, about the land, right? About these districts, how we think about place, even the hard questions that Beverley posed about growth, all of those things, place. We can't forget the people, because I think people has been the forgotten element here, for sure. But I mentioned the policymakers and the people who are making these decisions. It's important to have people at the table who are informing these discussions for sure. That I think we have to look at the H board. I think term limits are important. I think we have to think about equity in terms of those boards, because that board has a lot of power and always has. So it's not, so it's about the people who are making the decisions. It's about asking the questions about the people that are being impacted and about future generations, as Mark implied, and about the people that continue to live there. But as you continue that revisioning, the systemic issues have to be addressed. One of those is the H board.
You know, the people that serve on the H board put in an enormous amount of time as volunteers. And I think in the past, it's been difficult to find people to serve on the H board because it is so much work.
A large time.
So I think
there's plenty of ways to solve that.
Diversity on the H board, and Cecilia Rios has been on the H board off and on for I think 23 years, and has been an amazing force for the H board, a tireless worker. So limiting term, having term limits sounds like a good idea, but it is hard to find people to serve on the H board.
I think the reason it's hard to find people to serve on the H board is because what the H board is charged with is fundamentally wrong.
Yes.
And we treat every building like a monument. Yep. And this goes back to like my first slide. These buildings are not monuments. It would be very simple to rewrite the code to which Lisa and her staff could perform a very quick staff review and be done with it, and not argue over, whether the window can be 6 inches wider or the muntin is a 1 inch or 7/8 of an inch. That's many of these things that we regulate are irrelevant, and we've boxed ourselves into the amber of preservation.
More than 20 years ago, my firm did a study of West Side Guadalupe, I think before it was even made a historic district. And I personally went down, building by building, street by street. And at that time, it had not been gentrified.
I read that report, Beverley. It was magnificent.
It is magnificent.
It was fascinating because it was a Hispanic community, and most people had built their own houses, and you could tell there were little, works of craftsmanship and included materials, and maybe half the houses or a third had a little plaque out there, Los Montoyas or Los Griegos or whatever. And it was really wonderful. And that's, of course, changed with gentrification. But the fact that in Santa Fe, there used to be, and still are in places, handmade buildings, personalized buildings is great. And the H board often doesn't recognize those eccentricities, but they're wonderful.
The ordinance.
Thank you so much,
to
Beverley.
do it.
That's true. Thank y'all so much. I just want to touch on one last question, or sort of a combination of two questions, and that also speaks to something that Estevan brought up, and that is to empower the people so that they feel like they have the access to the knowledge about these documents that we're talking about. I would like to just offer two things. One is that Estevan, where can someone find Culture Connects? How do they get a hold of that document if they'd like to see the data?
Lisa, you can probably say it's on the city website, right?
You can search on City of Santa Fe Culture Connects. I'll also say that the Friends of Architecture Santa Fe has taken it upon ourselves to make accessible online a whole list of city plans and documents from the last 50 years, and we're continuing to work on building that archive. And actually, internally in the city, we're talking about how to make that an official city archive, and figure out ways to make city planning documents and research studies more accessible to the public, but also make accessible to the public archival materials like maps and photos and historic building inventories and all of this wealth of information, not to mention all of the interviews that were done as part of Culture Connects, and then following that as part of Presente, and now through the Midtown Project and the Heritage Preservation Plan. We're collecting a series of oral history interviews through an organization that you all probably know, Little Globe. And they're a wonderful set of recorded voices from our community. So we're talking about ways to archive those and make them more accessible. But for now, you can look on architecturesantafe.org, or you can search on the City of Santa Fe. There are some documents available on the City of Santa Fe website. So I just want to say thank you, Rachel, for moderating that discussion. It was a wonderful discussion. There were many questions we did not get to, but I want to turn it over to Anthony Guida to wrap up and say a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, everybody, for staying late. I really appreciate it. As a member of the H Board, I was really happy to see so many of my colleagues in the attendee list tonight. So this is an important conversation. It's one that we want to keep going, and one that we at Friends of Architecture will follow up on. Lisa pointed out we didn't get to all of the questions. We hope to have the opportunity to do this again. We know that this is a popular and important conversation in Santa Fe. Thanks everybody for attending. Huge thank you to our panelists and their brilliant presentations, and speaking with all of us tonight: Shawn Evans, Beverley Spears, Mark Mitchell, and Estevan Rael-Gálvez. To our amazing revisioning history team, tonight's organizer and host, Lisa Roach, our incredible guest moderator, Rachel Preston Prinz, and thank you, Gayla Bechtel, for running everything behind the scenes. To all the members of our Friends Board, especially our Friends VP, Annette Propository, who makes us look good with our website and communications. Yes. Quick shout out to Robert Innes and Design Corps for the graphics for these events. And most of all, we want to thank you, the audience. We had close to 100 people join us tonight, and many of those people stayed late. This is a great audience of architects, planners, designers, developers, builders, creatives, advocates, and citizens. Thank you for being enthusiastic participants in this discussion. Upcoming events, an opportunity to really continue some of the conversations and points that we were discussing tonight. Pecha Kucha Volume 8 with the theme of ghosts will be Wednesday, October 28th at 6 p.m. If you would like to take this theme on, have a body of work that is appropriate, send our PK team a brief summary through our contact page, also found on our website, architecturesantafe.org. Submission deadline is this Sunday, August 30th. Revisioning housing and revisioning sustainability are two of the next sessions in the Revisioning History series. We hope that you will join us for that. Dates are to be announced. Once again, thank you for participating in our events. Friends is the only nonprofit organization in Santa Fe with an interdisciplinary focus on design and the built environment. Our events offer opportunities and a forum for connection, mutual education, discussion, and ideation, and as well as advocacy. If you like what we do, please give us some money. Please continue to support us in our mission, and certainly by attending and participating in events like these. You can make a donation to sustain our efforts at architecturesantafe.org. Thanks for being a friend. We'll see you soon. Panel, you're amazing. Thanks so much. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, y'all.